People who have gastrointestinal function and they get well, but 3 months later, they're sick again. They have insulin resistance. They do well for a little while, but 6 months later, they're sick again. They have an autoimmune disease that seemed to get better, partial remission, but then they were right back where they were before. This revolving door of disease. The functional medicine lens, at least on our watch, it's not enough to help someone to get well. That's a wonderful service. It's a very blessed offering, but it's not enough. We've got to help people get well and stay well. The most common combination that is at play in that revolving door of disease is some aspect of adrenal-thyroid dysfunction. Welcome to Functional Medicine for Real-World Impact, where we're diving into the complex, interconnected nature of health and disease, exploring not just theory, but practically what it takes to turn functional medicine insight into powerful, practical, real-world results. So please hit subscribe and let's get started. I'm super excited today to talk about the adrenal-thyroid axis, the two strongest, I believe, aspects of creating chronic disease dynamics underlying all of the other epidemics that we wrestle with in our practice. People who have gastrointestinal function and they get well, but 3 months later, they're sick again. They have insulin resistance. They do well for a little while, but 6 months later, they're sick again. They have an autoimmune disease that seemed to get better, partial remission, but then they were right back where they were before. This revolving door of disease. The functional medicine lens, at least on our watch, it's not enough to help someone to get well. That's a wonderful service. It's a very blessed offering, but it's not enough. We've got to help people get well and stay well. Sometimes it's primarily about the adrenals and maybe cortisol levels. Sometimes it's primarily about the thyroid, but most often it's the combination of the two, and there are lots of flavors of that. But let's face it, hypothyroid and hyperadrenal, right, are so often involved, especially in strong stress-mediated dynamics, where, of course, we spend a lot more of our time in a sympathetic nervous system mode than our bodies are really designed to, right? We talk about basics all the time at SAFM. We can geek out and study all of the rich biochemistry and physiological interconnectedness, but we got to come back to the fact that the body is designed to weather stress, weather trauma, weather crisis, but for periods of time that end. They have an ending. It does stop, right? So that we can manage to survive during times of threat when our sympathetic nervous system activates and protects us from the effects of stress to make sure we can fight, flight, and hide and lift cars off of small children and not die. But it's a very disease-promoting state to be in. There's a massive amount of oxidative stress and damage that happens when the body is in that fight, flight, and hide mode. So survival, longevity, vitality depends on the end of that sympathetic period and going into a parasympathetic nervous system mode that allows healing, right? A wonderful mantra, a wonderful thing to share with your patients and clients from an educational viewpoint is all healing is a parasympathetic activity. All healing. Barely getting by, totally sympathetic. The body will help you do that and get through amazing levels of stress and crisis. It's incredible what the body has gotten us through over our existence as a species. But healing, sustainable healing is a parasympathetic response, and you don't get that. The body doesn't let you have it unless it is convinced that our survival is assured and we are able to move into more of a parasympathetic, which is about resting and digesting and healing and making babies and all of these yummy, juicy, fun parts of life, right? That are about vitality and thriving. They're not about surviving at all. But the body is going to protect us in the name of survival first. And we only earn a parasympathetic nervous system mode. And the body doesn't give a crap what you're telling yourself. It's paying attention to all the other dynamics in your life, right? We may be putting on a happy face, but you don't fake your body out of the actual source of stress in your life. You don't fake your body out of knowing regardless of what you tell your friends or you tell your mother or act like, the body knows your real state of stress. And we don't activate functions in the body that are parasympathetic driven in any durable fashion unless the body is convinced of our survival. Now is the time, as people begin to shift gears in various pockets of our cultures and communities. Now is the time to promote healing. Now is the time to start looking at what is the state of the adrenal-thyroid axis. Certainly, we are seeing in all the different cases that get reviewed at SAFM on a day-over-day basis, a huge amount of hypothyroid function and disordered adrenal function. Still lots of hypercortisolemia. But interestingly enough, some of the sources of acute stress, both emotional and mental and physiological, what we're starting to see is actually a larger wave of hypoadrenal, right? A hypocortisol state, which is a real problem given cortisol is a master hormone and plays a really important cross-system regulatory role in the HPA-TG axis. But I'm going to come back to that in a moment because I want to talk about the thyroid in particular. Because we've got to start looking at assessing thyroid function in every person who comes into your practice who is struggling with chronic disease. Even if you think it has nothing to do with the thyroid, their thyroid seems fine, that doesn't stand out. They have an autoimmune disease. They have a immune hypervigilance, right? Maybe asthma disease. They have insulin resistance. They have atherosclerosis, et cetera, et cetera. But way more often than you may realize, underlying those those disease-promoting dynamics, part of what is causing them to be sustained is impaired thyroid function. And I'm going to start using the word function instead of talking about thyroid hormone levels, because one of the most important truths for all of us to remember, and you may hearken back to your anatomy and physiology, we all learn this, but somehow we can easily lose sight of it as we expand and grow our practices and get more clinical seasoning. The very fact that in terms of thyroid hormone function, yes, we have an HPA-TG axis, right? And the hypothalamus and the pituitary in the brain are working together in order to orchestrate the release of thyroid stimulating hormone. That is not a thyroid hormone. It's a brain hormone. We know this. It comes out into the body and it stimulates the beautiful butterfly-shaped thyroid gland in our throats. And TSH stimulates the synthesis of T4 thyroid hormone, right? That is the only exclusive thyroid hormone. That is primarily what the thyroid actually makes, depending on the person, between about 80 and 92% T4. And T4 is really more of a storage hormone, right? Like so many hormones in the body likes to have a good, readily available supply as protection, buffer for making sure that we have the ability to shift and navigate in the unexpected times that we ask our bodies to try to thrive in. And hormones are messengers in the body, right? The orchestrated messaging that's happening in order to translate our environment, both superficial and external to us, as well as our thoughts, which is a massive part of our environment. And for a lot of people, that's a serious disease promoter. But that's a topic for another day. Your brain is taking all these cues and clues about our environment and telling the whole systemic body, sending basically email with hormones to say, yo, dude, here's what's going on. This is how I think we need to adjust. So that TSH is stimulating the thyroid to primarily make a whole bunch of T4. Some of which the thyroid gland has to keep because it's going to convert that T4 to T3 for its own needs. But a lot of that T4 goes out elsewhere in the body, right? Some of it gets lost in the urine. Some of it gets metabolized in the liver. But T4 is being sent out to cells throughout the body, right? In order to enter the cell and be converted to the thyroid hero, which is T3 thyroid hormone. That's an intracellular conversion, an intracellular conversion. And so this is wonderful. It makes perfect sense. If you're a cell and you've been told you have a really important job, you're a brain cell, you're a liver cell, you're a kidney cell, you're a left big toe cell, right? You guys are important. You have critical jobs, but you got to have fuel. And so if you were a cell and you were advocating for yourself, like, no way, I don't want to be dependent on the thyroid. The thyroid could lose its mind and not deliver supply to me. I need to be fueled the way I need to be fueled at any given moment to keep myself healthy and do my job. So that's okay. I'll take your T4, but I'm going to convert T4 to T3 on my own intracellularly as needed for my unique intracellular needs. So we need to remember that where the site of thyroid function actually happens is due to T3 thyroid hormone fitting into nuclear receptors on the inside of a cell. You can't see it. You can't measure it in the blood. And there's lots of reasons why what's in the blood and what's happening in the internuclear environment for a given cell are not the same thing. There are plenty of examples of people in your practice who are actively having intracellular hypothyroid function, but their labs look perfect, right? Critical foundational truth that we teach practitioners at SAFM. Lab data is wonderful. It's a huge resource and tool, but it is one puzzle piece in looking at putting together all the various puzzle pieces for a unique individual. And it is not enough to look at labs. Do not settle for the insufficient practice of treating people purely based on labs. Many people have intracellular hypothyroid function. Their case is screaming that based on their history, their diet, their symptoms, their challenges. But their labs look perfect. We've always got to consider labs if we have them. It's wonderful, but that is one puzzle piece, just one. And there are a lot of people that our practitioners are seeing in their practice, and they've been told for the longest time, no, it's not your thyroid, you're fine. And we start going in all sorts of different directions, right? It's not your thyroid, it's fine. You need estrogen. It's not your thyroid, it's fine. You need a counselor. It's not your thyroid, it's fine. You need to sleep more. Here's some Ambien. It's not your thyroid, it's fine. You need an antidepressant. Maybe, right? Those are all valid solutions and remedies for people who actually need them. But an awful lot of the people who are being told that have intracellular hypothyroid function, and they need someone to engage with them beyond the labs and do a deep dive in understanding not just the ways in which the labs can be helpful or even diagnostic, but what are the ways in which they can be crazy misleading. And we are missing the forest for the trees because we're looking for the labs to always explain what is at play in a person. And this is a huge reason why we're not helping people to get at the actual root causes of their disease dynamics and address them. So let's talk about some of the scenarios of what is happening. I appreciate that some of the concepts I'm going to address here are a bit more advanced, but I know many of you are really quite savvy, and I've only got a limited time here, but I'm going to try and cram some of the really special pearls in here for you today. Because there are a lot of integrative or functional practitioners who are under the impression that all hypothyroid function is autoimmune. It's all Hashimoto's, right? My friends, not true. That sounds great, and I understand subclinical autoimmune dynamics are rampant in our practices. However, they are not universal. And I think you can see that. Even if you look at published peer-reviewed research, we totally agree that the incidence of autoimmune dynamics and hypothyroid is between 30 and 98%. I don't know about you, but the geek in me says that's not very conclusive, right? 30 to 98%. That says it depends a lot on what patient population you're actually looking at in that particular study. And so, yes, autoimmune dynamics, especially subclinical Hashimoto's, is present. And it is a dynamic that we must learn to address because autoimmune diseases, regardless of which body part is the victim of the dysregulated immune function, whether it's the thyroid in Hashimoto's or Graves' disease or the the pancreas and type 1 diabetes, or the myelin sheath of neurons and multiple sclerosis, right? There are so many victims, but dysregulated immune function is a common root cause of those. And as a practitioner, I want you to get super savvy about assessing and reversing those disease dynamics, because it can be done. And I believe we're going to see more and more of that in our practices. And so it's an area we need to become experts in our practices. But let's take a look at some things that are separate from, and they may be synergistic with, they may turn into an autoimmune dynamic, but there are way more diverse root causes of hypothyroid function than just having clinically high levels of thyroid peroxidase antibody. First of all, I want to talk about selenium, diet, nutrients, right? Because without getting into too much of the physiology, the pituitary is sending out thyroid stimulating hormone. It stimulates in the thyroid several different activities. In particular, it stimulates the synthesis of thyroid peroxidase, which is going to start to put together, like a sculpture, T4 thyroid hormone. The challenge is that the synthesis and the activity of thyroid peroxidase is a hot, fiery, oxidative mess. And so this generates a lot of free radicals, and we need to have good intracellular antioxidant function in order to withstand this and keep the localized tissue really healthy. People who have subclinically elevated levels of TSH all the time, bam, 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 that is a lot of TPO stimulation that's doing a lot of free radicals inside of the thyroid, right? And creating oxidative stress and potentially oxidative damage to the tissue in the thyroid. And this is where nutrients become very important. And in particular, I want to talk about selenium. Glutathione peroxidases, for example, are hugely dependent. There are a number of different selenium-dependent enzymes that help the body to create redox balance, right? This dance between reduction and oxidation, reduction and oxidation. Inside the body is a constant metabolic fire where an awful lot of functional balances, just day-to-day breathing and metabolism, generate a lot of free radicals, generate a lot of oxidative stress, and we have to weather that well. Otherwise, the localized tissue gets smoked and charred and damaged in the midst of all of that oxidative fire. And so we generate, for example, hydrogen peroxide, right? And as a result of TPO, thyroid peroxidase synthesis, the other thing TSH is doing is pulling iodide into the thyroid and making iodine, right? So that it can attach to tyrosines in the thyroglobulin, attached to the thyroglobulin scaffold. It's a lot of creation happening there that has a tremendous amount of antioxidant need, and that's primarily being satisfied with glutathione. And if we don't do that, then this is how we can end up with a lot of oxidative damage that the immune system has to come and repair, that if it's chronic, actually contributes to an autoimmune dynamic, which speaks to the fact that sometimes I believe there's been subclinical hypothyroid function happening for years or decades that turns into an autoimmune dynamic, and then it gets our attention, which we have to start looking for subclinical hypothyroid function in order to get in front of and prevent that. But we need selenium. We've got to start assessing selenium in patients and clients. It is a person who is eating a lot of crap food, a lot of highly processed foods. We know that minerals tend to be something that people go deficient on prior to a lot of classic vitamins, right? And so selenium is something that I really think we need to be assessing in our patients and clients so we can determine where we need to boost that, whether it's through food sources like Brazil nuts, for example, are an excellent source, a variable source, but certainly an excellent source of selenium that we need to be bringing into the body on a regular basis. Obviously, selenium supplements are an option as well, but we need to be providing sufficient selenium. We've also got to be getting enough iodine. There's a lot of good old school subclinical hypothyroid because people don't have enough iodine in order to satisfy the body's needs. And the iodine sufficiency, a lot of practitioners tend to assume that if people are using iodized salt, that they're getting optimal levels of iodine simply from that. And this is not held out actually with published research. And so people can end up with a long-standing subclinical hypothyroid dynamic where there may be a subclinical elevation in TSH and a subclinical depression in total T4 thyroid hormone that we're not going to see unless we're looking for it. And this starts to remind us of the distinction between normal lab values and optimal lab values, right? There's plenty of disease. There's plenty of dysfunction and suffering inside of normal reference ranges. And so there needs to be a sufficient iodine, and iodine plays a number of critical roles. It's actually important in all hormone intensive tissues, so not just in the thyroid, but for example, also important in the breast and the prostate and the uterus in order to protect us from hyperplasia or again, oxidative damage to cells in those tissues. But one of the things that we see is goiter. And the belief that somehow having iodized salt gets rid of goiter, it's definitely reduced the incidence of goiter for sure, but it is still present. You're still going to see it in your practices. And of course, this is just evidence of hyperplasia of the thyroid as it's working harder and harder in order to bring enough iodine into the body. And so they're definitely looking at iodine sufficiency as critical in the face of goiter. And also because if goiter is longstanding, a lot of TPO generation, a lot of oxidative demands, the need for selenium also goes up. And if people don't have enough antioxidant function internal to the thyroid, then this is where we can start to see nodules in addition to goiter based on the oxidative damage to that tissue. And then again, that dynamic can actually even progress into an autoimmune dynamic. Not the only driver for sure for an autoimmune dynamic in the thyroid, but a point of interconnectedness that you definitely want to look for. Another dynamic that you will often see has to do with what I call estrogen-mediated hypothyroid function. Higher estrogen states increase levels of binding globulins in the body. This makes perfect sense in terms of protecting survival of the species and the need during pregnancy in order to make sure that hormones are very finely regulated in order to support the survival of both the mother and the fetus. And so increased estrogen states increase thyroxine binding globulin, which starts to bring in the difference between total levels of thyroid hormone and free levels of thyroid hormone. And coming back to endocrine basics, we know that people can have not only normal, but seemingly optimal levels of total hormone, whether that's total T4 thyroid hormone or total testosterone. But the amount of that that's actually free for cellular effects is going to depend on the levels of binding globulins. And we have a variety of those. Thyroid hormone is predominantly bound to thyroxine binding globulin, but also to thyretin and albumin. But if an estrogen dominant or high estrogen type of state increases the binding globulins, if we're not looking at levels of free hormone that are actually available to enter cells and cause cellular effects, then again, total hormone levels may look seemingly optimal, but people may be experiencing intracellular hypothyroid function. And so this is an important distinction in terms of thinking about high estrogen states. Keep in mind that we can look for dynamics like highly symptomatic premenstrual syndrome, really heavy menstrual bleeding, these types of things, especially bloating, mood disorders, headache, high cravings, these types of things that can really make a menstrual cycle highly debilitating for women. However, keep in mind that a high estrogen state is not necessarily going to show up in looking at things like serum estradiol, right? We could be talking about some of the same dynamics that I'm talking about the thyroid with in the world of sex hormones, and especially with estrogen. We are exposed in classic, or I should say, typical modern lifestyle choices, an awful lot of endocrine disrupting chemicals, many of which influence estrogen levels, either through direct estrogen mimicry in terms of fitting into receptors and activating estrogenic effects, maybe by being an agonist for an estrogen receptor so that natural endogenous hormones have a stronger effects. Some endocrine disrupting chemicals disrupt our ability to detoxify and excrete certain hormones. And so this is where toxins, chemicals, in whether it's in our foods, our beverages, personal hygiene, beauty products, cleaning products, especially things we slather on our skin that we can readily absorb the residue of into our systemic body. A person can have moderate, normal, maybe even low normal levels of endogenous estrogens. But because of xenoestrogenic effects, they actually are struggling with the estrogen dominant state. And so again, lab value is only one puzzle piece. We have to look actually at the symptom experience. But a high estrogen state can interfere with excess levels of binding globulins that can make all the difference between total hormones and free hormones. So something that we want to keep an eye on in terms of creating a hypothyroid state. Another example of a flavor on the spectrum or color on the spectrum of hypothyroid function has to do with stress. There are a few dynamics in which strong ongoing stress can create a hypothyroid state. And I think if you think about it, this is part of the body's wisdom. If we are really stressed out and we're in a sympathetic nervous system mode and we are fighting, flighting, and hiding, and the body more than anything wants to survive, it makes perfect sense that the body is going to begin to lock down on more highly control and conserve metabolic resources so that we don't die of hunger while we're fighting, flighting, and hiding. And as primal as that may sound, that is very much the design that our physiology follows during times of stress. And this is mediated in several places in the HPA-TG axis, but one of them is the stress-mediated suppression of pituitary release of thyroid-stimulating hormone. It's part of actually how the whole HPA-TG axis can respond to the need to prioritize survival. And so we can actually have a suppression of the feedback process, right? It's a negative, restraining feedback process with regard to thyroid hormone that can actually cause there to be lower levels of thyroid stimulating hormones. So even though the cells are wrestling with a relative hypothyroid state, the brain is being less responsive, and not because perhaps things are broken, right? We can have other dynamics. We can have insulin resistance, which I'll get to in a second, which can impair the brain's ability to respond. But in a strong stress dynamic, I believe it's part of the design of human physiology in order to conserve metabolic resources that we end up in a hypothyroid state. Again, a subclinical one that can cause a lot of suffering when it becomes someone's chronic state of existence. But again, we have to look beyond the labs in order to see this. Another interesting dynamic that happens, however, when we're doing this, you may see TSH levels still remain optimal, but you'll start to see T4 go down, right? And the brain is just not responding. So T4 may start to trend down, and T3 may stay at its optimal level, or it may begin to trend down as well. Another stress-mediated dynamic that happens intracellularly during times of high stress is a shift in which of the deiodinase enzymes are more dominant. And we can get into some richer detail here, but to summarize, we have three primary deiodinase enzymes that help us to ensure the orchestration of thyroid hormone function. D1, D2, D3. And it's primarily D1 that is taking T4, converting it to T3, and then sending it back out in circulation. That's largely what you are measuring when you're looking at blood levels of T3 thyroid hormone. But during times of sympathetic nervous system, lots of stress, D1 becomes downregulated. And actually what works more aggressively is D2. And what D2 is doing that I mentioned earlier is it's taking T4 and turning it into T3 inside the cell for that cell's purposes. And so, again, the blood levels may not be well representing what's happening inside the cell, which is why we have to pay attention to people's full presentation in terms of getting a richer view and insight into what's happening in their bodies. So an interesting reflection on what's actually taking place from an adaptive perspective. Another dynamic that you're going to encounter in your practice is what I call illness-mediated hypothyroid function. And we're seeing a lot of this now with the incidence of COVID. And we know that people are having a huge diversity of experiences with COVID. Some people have really quite mild disease, very noticeable, not very noticeable, or largely asymptomatic. Other people have what feels more just like a bad cold. For some people, it feels more like a typical flu. Other people, it's much more severe, highly debilitating, life-threatening. There's a massive spectrum. But we know that one of the hallmark cytokine profiles that is associated with COVID disease, and it's actually well associated with the severity of it, is levels of interleukin-6 in terms of a particular cytokine. And systemic inflammatory states, obviously the body has to adapt to this as well. And it makes perfect sense that it would want to modulate our HPA-TG axis in order to help us weather what is at play. And we need to be able to create a healing environment in order to counter an infection, in order to promote tissue healing. And so one of the ways in which the body actually does this is to downregulate D1 and even downregulate the activity of D2 and instead upregulate the activity of D3 deiodinase. Now, D3, unfortunately, given the life experience that most people want to have, is a deactivating deiodinase. D3 is that culprit that many of us refer to that is supporting not only the synthesis of reverse T3, right? It's turning T4 into reverse T3, which is a almost fully inactive. It's not 100%, but almost inactive version of T3. It has very little affinity actually for the nuclear receptor, which I'll get to in a second. But the deiodinase 3, D3 is converting T4 to reverse T3, but even worse than that, my friends, it is taking T3 and turning it into an inactive form of T2. And I want to focus on this for a second because I find this is a physiological truth that we don't often involve, even in our progressive conversations about thyroid function and sufficiency. Too many conversations in the functional world focus only on reverse T3. That's the big problem. That's the big culprit, right? As long as we're converting T4 to T3, end of story, we're fine. We just want to not make reverse T3. We don't want to have too much reverse T3 that stops T3 from working. That's largely true, but there's some nuance here that I really want to make sure that you all bring on board, which is in an illness state, when there's a lot of inflammation, what D3 is doing is not just turning T4 into reverse T3. It's breaking down T3. It's reducing T3 intracellularly on purpose in the name of healing. So think about that for just a minute, right? In order to heal, we got to create a parasympathetic state, right? When stress hormones are really high, can we well fight infection? No, we know that, right? High levels of glucocorticoids suppress immune function. So when we're wrestling with an infectious dynamic, we don't overcome it very well. It makes perfect sense that the body would want to just turn down the volume on the stress and on the metabolic demands. But when people have the longer simmering version of COVID, or for that matter, when people have long-standing reactivation of all sorts of different viruses, right? People with long-standing Epstein-Barr, for example, right? Shingles, long-standing mono, Hashimoto's that does have Epstein-Barr as a major trigger, which is not all, nothing is always true, but is certainly a prevalent, acknowledged source and activating factor for Hashimoto's. This sort of ongoing high viral load is creating this chronic higher inflammatory state that's creating intracellular hypothyroid function on purpose. And again, it's not just making reverse T3 go up, it's making T3 go down. It's converting T3 into an inactive form of T2, which is important because T2 is really essential. Too often we think T3 is the only important thing. Actually, T2 actually agonizes increases the action of T3 and has its own downstream nuclear activation effects as well. T2 being especially important for increasing fatty acid oxidation in the body in order to use fat for fuel, right? Stimulating lipolysis in order to keep body fat from becoming excessive and in order to maintain optimal body composition and weight. So it's not just about T3. We need T2, but we need active T2. And that is not what the body is interested in doing when it is in a healing state. And this harkens back to some really important basics around, again, the necessity of a parasympathetic nervous system mode. People are struggling with ongoing viral disease, ongoing high viral load, and they're trying to power through and not understanding that as long as the body thinks we have to fight, flight, and hide for survival, that infectious dynamic is going to keep raging because the body is prioritizing just getting to tomorrow, just surviving for another day. We must stop the madness. We have to stop the rat race. I believe a huge part of our opportunity is to teach, educate, inspire, empower people to prioritize sleep. Not thinking about sleep as something you finally give into when you're so tired you can't stand it. But to go to bed an hour earlier than people think they need to, right? To prioritize sleep, to prioritize deep rest and rejuvenation. We have to convince our oh-so-intelligent nervous system that the war is over. We have to convince the nervous system that we're safe, that we feel like it's safe to try to thrive because our security is certain. And I get that these sound, these feel like loosey-goosey soft things, but they are having very real, hard anatomical and physiological effects on our body and on disease promotion, and people's biochemical resilience. And we have to, especially in the world of healthcare practitioners where there is a lot of trust, we have to be teaching people that yes, those seemingly simple, not so sexy, basic foundational aspects of health, they can make all the difference in the world as to whether or not someone actually gets well. And it will absolutely make all the difference as to whether someone gets well and stays well, or whether, again, it's the revolving door of illness. Can we move to a space where, and I get it, for some people, it's a matter of turning inward and being able to find a high vitality promoting inner environment, even when the external world is seemingly conspiring to put everybody in a state of permanent fight or flight, in which there's no way we can thrive. There's no way. The body is not designed to do that. We can want it, but we can't constantly make multifactorial day-over-day choices that promote a sympathetic nervous system mode and then expect to have a parasympathetic experience. It's scientifically illogical. Oh, we're not designed to work that way. And so we have to own the reality that the nervous system is taking cues and clues from everything that we are doing and experiencing, and the thoughts we have, the fears we have, the self, the self reflection thoughts that we have. Like I said in the beginning, you're not going to fake your body into believing that your stress is less than it really is. It's there in the middle of it. It sees exactly what you're going through. It's constantly eavesdropping on your thoughts. Our self-talk actually matters a lot. Two people can have the exact same life experience and exposure and have radically different responses to it. And therefore, their physiology will have radically different responses to that environment because of the experience, the bio-individual experience that we are having in it. And so I really want to emphasize this inflammation-mediated component of hypothyroid function because I think we're seeing more and more of that in the world of COVID, and especially people who are having moderate but long-standing experiences with COVID, where the immune system is containing it but not eradicating it. Or getting rid of the infection, but really struggling with ongoing, long-standing oxidative damage and dysfunction in various tissues. And I think we're seeing a lot of that in people's nervous systems, in particular, in terms of brain fog and neuropathy. Of also the ongoing loss of smell and taste, these kinds of things. The other one that I mentioned is insulin resistance, which we already know is epidemic in our practices, and not just with regard to hyperglycemia that eventually becomes severe enough to be diagnosable as prediabetes or full-fledged type 2 diabetes, but the massive amount of hyperinsulinemia that is happening for years and years. Published research says it'll at least 10 years, sometimes 13, 15, 18. A long time brewing and escalating before it becomes severe enough to affect pancreatic function to start to show up as hyperglycemia. We've really got to get better at assessing and flagging and treating insulin resistance before it starts to make blood sugar go up, which is actually in the later stages. But for purpose of today's topic, it's important to realize that when you have insulin resistance, it's affecting all the tissues in the body, including the brain. And we have started to understand through research over just the past decade or so that insulin resistance in the thyroid gland itself can contribute to the development of thyroid nodules. In fact, there's some interesting research that shows how metformin can actually counter thyroid nodules and improve thyroid function because it's countering the insulin resistance, metformin is, which allows the cells to work better, right? The mitochondria in the thyrocytes works better, so that cell is better able to do its job. Similarly, the brain, right? When there's insulin resistance in the brain, the hypothalamus and the pituitary don't work as optimally in order to be responsive with TRH and TSH in terms of responding to the thyroid state in the body. And for that matter, there's an interesting synergistic pattern here where thyroid action on a cell is actually part of what enables insulin sensitivity. But you need insulin sensitivity in the thyroid and in the brain to help have good thyroid function. So there is a synergistic, forward-feeding, collaborative activity happening across these hormones. And given the number of people out there who have insulin resistance and the number of people out there who have hypothyroid function, regardless of which came first, they are exacerbating one another. It's a really exciting time for looking at the application of cross-system silo research and looking at systemic functioning. But we're looking at markers of insulin resistance like HOMA-IR and the strong association between subclinical elevation in thyroid stimulating hormone, but an increased ratio of T3 to T4. So this is that perhaps surprising scenario where TSH is trending up subclinically. T4 is maybe in an optimal place. T3 is actually surprisingly high. And you're trying to figure out, why does this person have optimal levels of T3, but they have all these hypothyroid symptoms? Why is that happening? And this is a pattern of thyroid hormone resistance and again, the insulin resistance in the brain is also contributing to keeping the brain from being able to respond properly. But we can end up with thyroid hormone resistance. So in this case, there can actually in the blood be not only normal, but seemingly optimal levels of T3, but people are still experiencing intracellular hypothyroid function. And you can look for this. In fact, a couple of papers are alluding to the fact that based on their data, and it's just their sample, right? But based on their data, you can predict the eventual occurrence of metabolic syndrome based on this elevation of TSH and the T3 to T4 ratio. As again, being evidence of this thyroid hormone resistance type of pattern. Similarly, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. We're starting to understand just how much of that is being promoted by impaired fatty acid oxidation in the liver itself, right? You have to have good thyroid function in order to use fuel to generate ATP, and the liver's got a lot of jobs and it needs to have awesome mitochondrial function. You need insulin in the liver to work. You need thyroid hormone in the liver to work. And subclinical hypothyroid function in the liver can contribute to the liver's inability to deal with fatty infiltration because of high blood sugar. And this is where, again, a subclinical hypothyroid function can contribute to cardiometabolic disease. And then, of course, the liver is one of the tissues that expresses the highest level of D1 deiodinase. So it's responsible for a lot of T4 to T3 conversion. So the fattier the liver gets, the more it's contributing to imbalance in thyroid hormone. So I know this is a lot of facts and I'm coming at you quick, so you can always check it out later. But I think it's so important that those of you who are looking at this broader lens across foundational systems of specialty in the body, organ systems, at some of these interconnected effects, you can really start to see how there's a lot more disease promotion happening from hypothyroid function than we may have considered before. And so I think this is really critical. It starts to point out why we want to get good full thyroid panels. I believe that should include TSH, free T4, free T3, reverse T3, and not one, but both TPO and thyroglobulin antibodies, because we see lots of examples where one is not elevated at all, but the other one is clinically high. Please don't assume that just because one is elevated, the other one will also be elevated. That actually is not the case. We need to be running both. And there's some interesting profiles of why it would be one versus the other. But when we're really trying to get our hands wrapped around this, we need a good full thyroid panel. And then depending on the results that you receive, you may also want to go again and look at total levels of T4 or T3. You may want to expand depending on what you learn and go look at cortisol levels. You may want to assess iodine and selenium, like I mentioned. Lab data can be really helpful in these arenas. But let's talk about a couple of pitfalls around labs. One of the most important things that I think is well understood today, it was much more of a sort of just tribal wisdom maybe 10 years ago. But now more and more people are realizing just how much significant intake of biotin, vitamin B7, interferes with getting accurate thyroid lab panels. It interferes with getting accurate thyroid labs, not because the biotin is doing something negative to the thyroid hormones in your body. It's because of what it does in the actual assessment tools that the lab uses to run the assay. it will, in some cases, grossly skew thyroid hormone levels. And it's not just TSH, it can affect T4 and T3 as well. And so just a small, maybe 100%, 200, even 300% RDA of biotin that might just be in a multivitamin, highly unlikely to have any negative effects. But if people are taking a higher dose biotin, maybe for thinning hair or weak peeling nails, or biotin, higher dose biotin is also often used to improve insulin sensitivity. We must remember to make sure that people stop taking that supplement for at least 2 full entire days before they get a fasting first morning blood draw the morning of the 3rd day. I think it's good wisdom for all labs, to be honest, just to make sure that nothing is interfering. There are a number of supplements that can actually interfere with lab accuracy. But biotin you want to be particularly attentive to in the context of accuracy of thyroid hormone labs. And rather than worrying about the dose, just recommend that people stop taking anything other than maybe a probiotic or some digestive support. Otherwise, stop taking supplements unless you feel like they're having acute, triage type of effects, right? And then the vast majority of the cases with supplements, that's not going to be true. But continuing a probiotic or digestive support is important so we don't kick off dysfunction in the gut by taking it away for a few days. But stopping other supplements for 2 full days to make sure nothing interferes with that first morning blood draw utility on the morning of the 3rd day. I already spoke about this a little bit, but just a brief mention around reverse T3. I do think it's an important part of a good, comprehensive, functional thyroid panel. But keep in mind that people can be undergoing an awful lot of stress, and their reverse T3 levels are not necessarily going to be high. Keep in mind that people's reverse T3 levels are dependent on their T4 levels, right? Because it's about going upstream, right? No lettuce, no salad, right? You've got to have ingredients in order for the hormone enzymes to actually create these metabolites. And reverse T3 is created from T4. And people can have a strong stress environment where their reverse T3 levels are through the roof. And that you can tell right away that that's where a lot of their T4 is being shunted, is down that deactivation pathway. But some people will have a lot of stress and they'll have low T3 and they don't have high reverse T3, right? That can still be a stress or an inflammation mediated dynamic where we're just breaking down our T3. We're deactivating our T3. So reverse T3 is important, but let's not overemphasize or exaggerate the role that it plays. One of, I think, the biggest misnomers, and I have certainly been party to this in the past, is the assumption that the point of competition is in the receptors and that reverse T3 and T3 are actively competing like equals for the receptor. And that's actually not true at all. Thyroid hormone receptor has huge affinity for T3. It wants to be activated by T3. It has actually very little affinity for reverse T3. So the largest point of competition is not at the receptor. It's really about creating an environment where there's a lot of activity of that D3 enzyme that's breaking down the T3. So there's less available of it to fit into those nuclear receptors. And again, that's an intracellular dynamic. So let's just be cautious about really understanding what's happening. And this is why we want to look at both reverse T3 and levels of free T3, but keeping in mind that it's still only a small part, a small example of what is happening. And so I just want to say thank you for taking time out of your very busy life in order to keep adding clinical insights, scientific pearls to your practice, to stay abreast of additional insights that we're learning from recent peer-reviewed published research that most of you I deeply appreciate. You don't have time to review all yourself, right? It's one of our passions here at SAFM is making curated, peer-reviewed medical research available to you, not trying to protect you from that deep dive of learning. We think that's essential for deep understanding of the science, rather than just having handy-dandy charts that you reference. But when you don't actually deeply understand what's at play in the body, it directly interferes with our sense of capability and our ability to have strong confidence in knowing what we're talking about and being able to be an exceptional practitioner. That richness, that rigor is something we're really passionate about here at SAFM. A quick word about thyroid replacement. An awful lot of people in your practice are using T4 only synthetic thyroid hormone replacement, and they are still hypothyroid. They're taking the medication. Their labs may look perfect. Their TSH may be perfect. Their T4 may even be perfect. But if we're not looking at a full thyroid panel, if we're not doing a symptom assessment, we're going to lose sight of the devil in the detail, those nuances of, okay, they're taking the drug. The labs look perfect. They're still hypothyroid. They're still suffering. And there's all sorts of interesting publications now where different professional medical societies are taking the courageous choice of confronting the loud and courageous voice of patient populations who are saying, this treatment is not working for me. And we honor that truth because the concepts I've discussed today clearly points to the number of dynamics in which TSH and T4, first of all, you can't find in labs, which you're not looking for. But even if you assess them, they could be perfect. And people are still struggling because of these intracellular thyroid hormone dynamics. And this has to do with the fact that, like I said before, people can have plenty of T4, but if they are not, for a rich variety of reasons, using that to create optimal levels of T3, then they are going to still struggle. There's, plenty of animal thyroid hormone research, right? Which I think we have to be careful about relying on with regard to dosage extrapolations, because T4 to T3 conversion in animals like mice or rats is different than humans. Always want to be careful about extrapolating too much detail from animal research to human applicability. But the whole dynamic of realizing that sometimes part of why the body won't recover from a hypothyroid function is because the thyroid gland itself has to have optimal thyroid functioning to make thyroid hormone. And all of the other cells in the body for that intracellular T4 to T3 conversion, it's like a priming of a pump. You have to have enough thyroid function to create sustainable thyroid function. You have to prime the pump. And this is why so many people do better when some T3 is added to their medication, whether that's a compounded T4, T3 together or a natural thyroid extract, which also has the benefits of T2 and some of these other growth factors. But it brings us back to the truth that there's no one single answer. I will also say that there are people who do very well on T4 only medication. They thrive. So we want to be careful about not castigating the conventional standard of care either, because there are plenty of people who feel great, where their T4 to T3 conversion is awesome. Their particular mode of dysfunction is not in that conversion. And if you assess a full panel, you can see that. You will realize that. But some people go on a natural thyroid extract. They don't do well at all. What they need is a T4 only drug because they got too much T3 and it's sending them through the roof. Other people are on T4 dosages that aren't high enough because there's a one-time dosage and there's not a checking of a thyroid panel multiple times afterward to make sure that after the body adjusts, that dose is still optimal. We've done a few polls on this across our practitioner community at SAFM, and the average person needs at least 2, sometimes 3 or more dosage adjustments on any thyroid hormone replacement in order to find the optimal dosage that brings euthyroid function in terms of life experience, regardless of what the labs have to say. And so bioindividuality, we need to be keeping beginner's mind and looking at what is the optimal solution for this unique individual. And yes, the body is going to adjust because you give a hormone, and that's going to cause a downstream adjustment throughout pretty much the entire body. And people's response to a hormone therapy in week 1 may be very different from how they feel and what the experience is in week 4. So thinking about every 4 to 6 weeks, assessing again and maybe making a dosage adjustment until people are having a euthyroid experience, which can be really quite different than what the labs might say. Because of the widespread incidence, for example, of hypothyroid function, some people need to be really high in the normal range, or in a few cases, even clinically high, in order to actually have healthy functional thyroid balance in the body, to be returned to a euthyroid state. And so I think keeping beginner's mind in this space is really essential for ensuring that each person gets the best possible care and remediation of the dysfunctional hormonal dynamics in their unique body. And so I really want to encourage you to focus there. And then the thing that I'll end with, and I focused on thyroid today. I could do a whole nother live on cortisol and the adrenal. I've focused today primarily on that aspect of just creating stress, and the fact that multifactorial stress interferes pretty much with the activity of the entire hormonal axis, because really high levels of stress hormones are reflective of a sympathetic nervous system state, and it naturally wants to promote survival. And there's not a lot about survival that feels like thriving to people. Those are two radically different states of being. But the state of stress that could be promoting those elevated levels of stress hormones goes beyond whether people feel stressed. There are lots of people out there who will say, I don't feel stressed. I have a great relationship. I sleep well. I love my family. I have great friends. I don't feel stressed. Stress is not a problem for me. We have to teach people about the impact of physiological stress, because the body doesn't perceive stress as just our thoughts. It is eavesdropping on our thoughts. That's a component of its data feed on the state of our stress. But there's also physiological stress, and we often don't think about things like, for example, sleep apnea or asthma as being sources of stress in the body. Sleep apnea, people may think about it as an annoyance. I didn't sleep very well. I'm tired. It's annoying. But your body thinks during the middle of the night, when you have obstructive sleep apnea, the body realistically thinks you almost died multiple times. Of lack of oxygen. And this causes a surge of adrenaline multiple times in the middle of the night. And it's a huge contributor to baseline states of hyperadrenal function that doesn't only increase cortisol, it increases pulse, it increases blood pressure, it increases blood sugar. It's helping us to fight, flight, and hide, because the body thinks, I don't know what's going on, but we almost died multiple times in the middle of the night last night, and apparently we do that every night, and so I can't afford for you to thrive. I need to make you fat and hypervigilant and ensure we survive to another day. And from the body's wisdom perspective, this makes perfect sense in the name of survival, but it can create pretty miserable life experiences for people who don't know what's going on. And so we think about things like mouth breathing, sleep apnea, asthma, even controlled asthma, things like toxicity that folks are wrestling with, right? An estrogen dominant state, constant outgassing of mercury amalgam fillings from dental amalgam, things like high levels of circulating cytokines, maybe in response to a high viral load, for example. People are finding a way to weather it, but your body still knows behind the scenes, no, no, no. We need to survive. There's a threat here. We need to really focus on that. Too much aggressive exercise. Some people thrive off of really aggressive exercise because it may, especially if they have a hypoadrenal state, it may be one of the few times that they feel normal. Really, hyper stress, type A, perfectionistic women can be very attached to extremely aggressive exercise because it makes them feel calm. It makes them feel normal, but it's not helping their long-term hormonal balance, unfortunately, because it just makes the body think the war is not over and the stress is higher. And again, it's going to keep promoting survival. Which it points to the reality that the type of exercise is also that helps us to thrive is also bio-individual. But too much aggressive exercise can also be a source of stress for the body. And so we have to cast a broad net at looking at what are all the different types of stress that are contributing to this person's physiology, this person's HPATG axis, believing that our survival is not assured and we need to spend too much time in a sympathetic orchestration of our whole physiology in the name of survival. So I'm going to stop there in the interest of time. So much more we could talk about. And I'll close by saying two things. First of all, thank you so much for being here. It's my great pleasure to do this for our extended community of healthcare practitioners who are progressively expanding their skills. And if the kinds of things we talk about in these sessions inspire you and you have a restlessness to want to take your own personal knowledge and clinical skills to a whole nother level of capability, I invite you to check us out for your advanced training in applied functional medicine.